Have you ever wondered what happens when a man who's lost everything is given one last chance? Not by fate, but by God himself. In the deep silence of the Appalachian woods, a lonely veteran finds a freezing child and a loyal dog. But what seems like a rescue soon becomes a miracle that will change all their lives forever. This is not just a story about survival. It's about faith, forgiveness, and the quiet ways God still works through ordinary people. If you believe that miracles still exist, if you believe love can find us even in the darkest places, then stay with me till the end. Leave a comment to tell us what this story made you feel. Subscribe for more inspiring stories of faith and kindness, and may God bless you for being here today. The first snow of November had come early to the Appalachian Mountains. It fell in thick, quiet sheets that blanketed the forest in silence, muffling the sound of branches snapping under the weight of white. The nearest town, Miller's Creek, lay miles away, its few stores shuttered and chimneys breathing thin smoke into the cold morning sky. Beyond the last road, past where even hunters rarely went, stood a small wooden cabin surrounded by pine and birch, and there lived Ethan Cole. Ethan was 35 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, his frame still bearing the rigid discipline of his years in the Marine Corps. His face was lined in a way that suggested both strength and sorrow, a man weathered by things he didn't talk about. A short beard framed his jaw, and a faint scar ran from his right temple down to his cheek, a souvenir from a mission long ago in Kandahar. His eyes, a cold gray blue, were steady but distant, as if they were always watching something far beyond the trees. He had come to these woods 5 years earlier after his discharge, looking for peace and finding it only in silence. His only companion was Rex, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a coat the color of desert sand and a black saddle down his back. Rex was strong and alert, trained to respond to hand gestures and soft whistles. In the Marines, Rex would have been called a combat dog. But here, he was something simpler. Family. The two had found each other at a rescue shelter near Denver after Ethan returned home. Since then, they had been inseparable. Each morning, Ethan rose before dawn, fed Rex, and checked the snares he set the day before. He lived on deer meat, roots, and the small vegetables that grew stubbornly in the patch behind his cabin. Sometimes he would cut wood for the long winter. Sometimes he would fix the roof, humming songs no one else remembered. The forest had its rhythm, and Ethan had learned to live by it. Steady, quiet, and alone. That morning, the cold bit sharper than usual. Frost clung to the window frame like crystal vines. Ethan poured black coffee into a tin mug and stood by the door, watching snowflakes drift down like ashes. Rex waited beside him, ears twitching, tail still. "We'll check the traps by the river," Ethan said, his voice low and gravelly. Rex gave a soft bark, as if to answer. They stepped out together into the white silence. The forest was hauntingly still. Only the crunch of boots and the dog's breath broke the quiet. Ethan scanned the ground, as he always did, habit from years of patrol. Halfway down the trail, Rex froze. His tail lifted, nose twitching toward a clump of underbrush. Ethan's instinct tightened. He reached for the rifle slung over his shoulder. But what he saw next made him lower it immediately. There, half buried in snow, was a tiny red sweater, bright against the gray woods. It hung torn on a low branch, a sleeve dangling like a limp hand. Beneath it, faintly, pressed into the snow, were small footprints. Ethan crouched, brushing aside the flakes. The tracks were fresh, a child's. He looked around, scanning the tree line. The temperature couldn't have been more than 15 degrees, No one, least of all a kid, would last long out here. "Rex," Ethan murmured. The dog moved ahead, nose to the ground, following the scent. They wove between pines, through drifts of snow knee-deep in places. After a few minutes, Rex barked sharply. Ethan pushed through the brush and found him standing beside a small figure huddled beneath a rock ledge. The boy couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. His face was pale, his lips cracked, and his little hands clutched the torn edge of his sweater. His brown hair was matted with frost. He looked up weakly as Ethan approached, eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Hey," Ethan said gently, kneeling down. "It's okay. You're safe now." The boy didn't answer. His teeth chattered too hard for words. Ethan took off his coat, wrapped it around him, and lifted him easily into his arms. The child weighed almost nothing, just a bundle of cold and silence. Rex followed close as Ethan carried him back through the snow. Inside the cabin, the wood stove glowed faintly, the air warm and smoky. Ethan laid the boy near the fire and began to rub his hands and feet to bring color back to them. He poured a little hot water into a cup and added honey, coaxing the boy to drink. Slowly, warmth returned to his cheeks. "What's your name, kid?" Ethan asked. The boy hesitated. "Benji," he finally whispered, voice thin as the wind outside. "Benji," Ethan repeated softly. "You got family around here?" The boy shook his head, eyes filling with tears. I was playing by the river, and then I couldn't find my way home." Ethan sighed, glancing at Rex, who sat by the door watching. "You picked a bad day to get lost, buddy." Rex tilted his head as if understanding. He walked over and nudged Benji's hand with his nose. The boy flinched at first, then smiled faintly, fingers brushing the dog's fur. "That's Rex," Ethan said. "He's friendlier than he looks." The German shepherd lay down beside the boy, resting his head on Benji's knee. It was the first time in months Ethan had seen Rex relax so completely near a stranger. Maybe the dog knew something he didn't. Ethan cooked a small pot of soup from venison and potatoes, watching the boy eat in small, careful bites. "We'll figure things out tomorrow," he said, though he wasn't sure how. The snow was too thick for travel, and the nearest town was more than 15 miles away. For now, the boy would have to stay. When night came, Ethan gave Benji the bed and took the chair by the fire. Rex lay stretched across the floor between them, the silent guardian. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but inside the cabin there was a fragile peace, the kind that comes when two lost souls find each other by accident. Ethan leaned his head back and watched the flames flicker. He had spent years trying to escape the noise of the world, but that night, in the quiet of the forest, a new sound filled the cabin, the soft breathing of a sleeping child. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt something stir inside him that he had almost forgotten. The warmth of belonging. He didn't know yet that this small, shivering boy had just walked into his life to change it forever. The snow outside the cabin softened with each passing day, melting into thin rivulets that whispered of spring. But inside those wooden walls, life had already begun to thaw. The fire that Ethan Cole kept burning through the coldest nights was no longer just a source of warmth. It had become the heart of a small, unlikely family. Benji had been in the cabin for nearly 3 weeks, and the boy's strength was returning as surely as the morning light. The color had come back to his cheeks, and the hollowness in his eyes had been replaced by the curiosity of a child discovering a new world. His hair, once tangled and dull from frost, now glowed chestnut under the firelight. Ethan had trimmed it carefully with his old knife one afternoon, his hands rough but gentle. Ethan, who had spent years speaking only to the wind and his dog, found himself adjusting to the rhythm of another voice. He was 35, tall and broad-shouldered, his brown hair streaked with gray, and his face lined by time and solitude. The beard along his jaw was uneven, cut without vanity, but it softened the edges of a man once carved by war. He rarely smiled, but when Benji laughed, really laughed, something in his expression eased, if only for a moment. Every morning, Ethan would wake early and feed Rex, his loyal 5-year-old German shepherd. The dog's tan and black coat gleamed even in the dim light, and his intelligent brown eyes seemed to follow Ethan's every move. Rex had been trained in the military to read human emotion, to protect without hesitation, and now he seemed to have appointed himself guardian of both man and boy. Whenever Ethan opened the door, Rex would wait until Benji was bundled in his coat before leading the way outside. Benji had learned quickly, absorbing every lesson Ethan offered. The first was how to build a fire, a skill Ethan insisted was more important than reading a map. "You can find your way without a compass," he had said, kneeling by the hearth, "but you can't survive the cold without this." The boy's small hands fumbled at first, but soon he could arrange sticks and kindle with near-perfect precision. Ethan watched quietly, correcting only when needed. Rex often sat near them, ears twitching as sparks danced into the air. Sometimes Benji would toss him a small piece of dried meat as a reward, and the dog would catch it mid-air, tail wagging. "Good boy, Rex," Benji would say, giggling, and Ethan would allow himself a rare grin. Their days settled into a simple pattern: chopping wood, fixing tools, cooking venison stew, and exploring short distances beyond the cabin. Benji's world expanded with every step he took in the snow. The boy had a natural curiosity about everything: the shape of animal tracks, the way trees creaked when the wind blew through them, and how the mountains seemed to hum when snow fell too heavily. Ethan answered as best he could, teaching him names of birds, how to tell which way the river flowed, and which plants were safe to touch. At night, when the wind howled across the roof, Benji would sleep on the bed, Rex curled at his feet, while Ethan sat in his chair by the fire. He didn't need to speak to feel the peace that filled the room. Sometimes, though, he would whisper quietly to himself, a habit from years of isolation, small prayers of thanks he hadn't said since the war. The boy's breathing and the dog's quiet sighs were proof enough that life still had meaning. Meanwhile, far beyond the woods, the world was searching. In a town covered with posters and faded flyers, Sarah Parker wandered the frozen streets, clutching a photograph of her son. She was 35, slender and graceful but worn by grief. Her chestnut brown hair was tied back, and her pale blue eyes, once bright with warmth, had dulled from months of crying. She wore a beige coat too thin for the season and refused to rest, convinced that somewhere her little boy was waiting. Her husband, David Parker, a tall, clean-cut man of 40 with dark hair and a short beard, moved through life with quiet despair. A businessman by trade, he had tried to distract himself with work, but guilt ate away at him. He blamed himself for that day by the river, the moment he'd looked away for 1 second too long. Back in the forest, time blurred. The snow began to recede from the riverbank, revealing patches of earth and moss. The air grew softer, carrying the scent of pine sap and wet soil. Benji had begun to call Ethan Uncle Ethan, a title that startled the older man at first, but soon filled him with a strange pride. "You don't have to call me that." Ethan had said once, his voice caught between gruffness and affection. "I want to," Benji replied simply. Rex, always between them, seemed to approve. When the boy would stumble, Rex would nudge him back to balance. When Ethan chopped wood, Rex would stand guard. And when Benji laughed too loudly, Rex would tilt his head as if smiling too. One afternoon, Benji was carving a small figure from wood, a dog with pointed ears and a proud stance. "It's Rex," he said, showing it to Ethan. "He's my hero." Ethan took the carving and studied it for a long time. "You did good," he said quietly. "But you know, heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they just stay beside you when the world gets cold." That night, as the last of the winter snow fell, Ethan stood at the window, watching the flakes drift across the dark sky. The fire crackled softly behind him, and Benji slept soundly with Rex at his side. He thought of Sarah Parker, though he didn't yet know her name, and of a family somewhere praying for a miracle. He wondered if maybe, just maybe, God had led the boy to his door, not only to save Benji's life, but to give him back his own. Outside, the forest exhaled the last breath of winter, and for the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel alone. The seasons turned gently in the Appalachian woods, replacing the howling winter storms with mornings of golden mist and evenings where the air smelled of pine and rain. A full year had passed since the day Ethan Cole carried the lost boy out of the snow, and in that time, the cabin that once echoed with silence had become something else entirely. A home filled with small laughter, muddy footprints, and the steady rhythm of two hearts learning to live again. Benji had grown taller over the year, his cheeks now full of color instead of the pale, ghostly shade from that first winter. His dark brown hair often stuck up in every direction, impossible to tame, and his curious green eyes seemed to study everything with wonder, from the patterns of frost on the windows to the way Rex's ears twitched at distant sounds. He was a clever, restless child, kind-hearted, but stubborn in a way that reminded Ethan of his younger self. He helped with chores, though often distracted by butterflies or squirrels, and his constant questions filled the quiet like sunlight through branches. Ethan, for his part, had changed too. The edges of his loneliness had softened, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of purpose. His beard had grown thicker, flecked with gray, but there was warmth now in the eyes that once stared blankly at the horizon. He was still a man of few words, shaped by discipline and grief. But Benji had a way of disarming his silence. The boy would chatter about imaginary kingdoms or ask why trees creaked when they were dreaming, and Ethan would find himself smiling without meaning to. Every morning, after breakfast cooked on the old iron stove, Ethan would take Benji and Rex down to the river. The boy learned to cast a fishing line, his small fingers fumbling at first, but growing more sure each day. Rex, ever the guardian, stayed close, his fur gleaming under the sunlight, occasionally barking at ripples in the water as if they were threats. He was 6 now, mature, confident, and proud, but still full of playful energy whenever Benji threw him a stick or dared him to race down the bank. By midsummer, the cabin had become something alive. Wildflowers grew along the porch. Benji's wooden carvings, crude figures of deer and birds that Ethan taught him to make, lined the windowsill. Ethan's garden thrived, the rows of beans and potatoes neat and green. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Rex sprawled between them, And Ethan would tell stories about the stars. Not war stories, but gentle tales of heroes who never gave up, of soldiers who came home and built something instead of destroying it. It was peace. A fragile, humble kind of peace. But peace has a way of ending when you least expect it. One early autumn morning, Ethan decided to take a cart of vegetables and dried herbs into town. He rarely did. The cabin had everything he needed. But Benji wanted to see the market. The boy had never been beyond the woods since he was found, and his excitement was impossible to deny. "We'll just trade for supplies and come back," Ethan said, ruffling the boy's hair. Rex barked, already waiting by the door. The drive into Miller's Creek took nearly an hour along winding dirt roads bordered by orange and red leaves. The town was small, with a single street of stores, a grocery, a post office, a hardware shop, and the gas station where a familiar face now worked the morning shift. Emily Parker stood outside, refilling the paper towel dispenser at the pump, her blonde hair tied back beneath a faded blue cap. Her eyes lifted as the old truck rattled to a stop. She smiled faintly. "Well, look who the storm dragged in." Ethan gave a small nod, his usual half-smile. "Didn't think you'd still be working here." "Bills don't pay themselves," she said lightly, then crouched to pet Rex, who wagged his tail happily. "And you still remember me, don't you, boy?" Benji leaned shyly against the truck door, studying her. Emily smiled at him. "And who's this?" "This is Benji," Ethan said. "He's been staying with me." Emily's smile softened. She didn't ask for details. She'd learned long ago not to pry. But there was something about the boy's face, the innocence in his eyes, that stirred a faint ache in her chest. "You're a lucky kid," she said. "That one saved lives before you were even born." They chatted briefly, traded small pleasantries. Emily handed Ethan a fresh loaf of bread on the house, and he promised to bring her some of his dried herbs next time. Then they drove on toward the town square, where a weekend market had sprung up beneath colorful awnings. Benji's excitement was contagious. He darted between stalls of apples, maple syrup, and hand-carved toys, asking endless questions. Ethan was carrying a basket of produce when he noticed it. Pinned to the community notice board outside the town hall was a weathered flyer, the edges curled, the ink faded but still readable. "Missing child, Benjamin Parker, age 7. Beneath the bold letters was a photograph, a smiling boy in a red sweater, his arm wrapped around a golden retriever. Ethan's chest went tight. His hands trembled as he stared at the photo, the same green eyes, the same uneven hair. It was Benji. For a long moment, the noise of the market vanished. All he could hear was the echo of his own heartbeat. Then a voice called from behind him. "Ethan, you okay?" It was Emily again, carrying a crate of bottled water. He turned, the color drained from his face. "That's him," he said quietly, nodding toward the flyer. Emily followed his gaze, her expression shifting from confusion to shock. My God, that's your boy?" Ethan shook his head slowly. "He's not mine." The truth hit harder than he expected. A year of laughter, lessons, meals shared by firelight, and suddenly he understood. It all had been borrowed time. Somewhere, a mother had cried herself to sleep every night. Somewhere, a family had been waiting. Emily placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You should tell them." "I will," he said, though the words felt heavy in his throat. That night, back in the cabin, Benji slept soundly under the quilt Ethan had patched for him. Rex lay nearby, his eyes reflecting the firelight. Ethan sat by the window, staring out into the endless dark. He reached down and scratched Rex's ear. "We have to do the right thing, boy," he whispered. Rex gave a low whine, pressing his head into Ethan's knee as if he already knew what tomorrow would bring. Outside, the autumn wind rustled through the trees, whispering the truth he could no longer ignore. The morning air carried the scent of pine and smoke as Ethan prepared the old truck for the trip into town. Frost glazed the windshield, and the early light shimmered through the fog hanging low over the trees. Benji stood nearby, a wool cap pulled over his messy brown hair, his eyes bright but unaware of the heaviness in Ethan's chest. Rex, ever attentive, waited by the truck, his tail still but his gaze fixed on his master, as if sensing something was different this time. Ethan loaded a small crate of vegetables in the back, mostly to keep up appearances. It was easier to explain a delivery than a confession. The drive was long and quiet. Benji hummed softly in the passenger seat, his voice mixing with the growl of the old engine. "Will we come back before dark?" he asked. Ethan's hands tightened around the wheel. "Maybe," he said after a pause. "Depends on how things go." They crossed the ridge road that curved above Miller's Creek and descended into the valley, where the trees gave way to rolling farmland and narrow country roads. As they neared town, Ethan's heart beat faster. He had rehearsed what to say, how to tell the family that their son had survived, that he hadn't meant to hide him, that it had all been an accident. But words had never been his strength. He only knew how to act, not explain. Emily Parker was outside the gas station again, this time unloading a delivery truck. She waved when she saw them. "Back so soon?" Ethan hesitated, pulling over. Benji waved shyly from the passenger seat. Emily noticed the tension in Ethan's face and frowned. "You found his family, didn't you?" He nodded. "Today's the day." Emily walked closer, her hands tucked in her jacket pockets. "You're doing the right thing," she said softly. "Even if it hurts." Ethan gave a small nod. "Yeah," he said quietly, eyes distant. "Hurts like hell, though." The Parker estate sat on the edge of Glenford, surrounded by iron gates and rows of manicured oaks. It was a mansion compared to Ethan's cabin, all white stone and glass, cold and perfect. As they approached, Benji's excitement grew. "This is it!" he shouted. "This is home!" Ethan parked by the curb, the gravel crunching under the tires. A security guard stepped out from the gatehouse, a tall man with a radio clipped to his vest. "Can I help you?" Ethan nodded toward Benji. "I believe this boy belongs here." The guard's eyes widened when he recognized the child. "Wait here," he said, hurrying through the gate. Within moments, the mansion door burst open, and a woman came running down the steps. Sarah Parker was in her mid-30s, tall and elegant, with chestnut brown hair that fell in loose waves to her shoulders. Her face, though beautiful, was drawn with months of worry. Fine lines etched near her eyes, lips trembling as if she'd forgotten how to smile. She wore a long cream coat, but her steps were reckless, desperate. Behind her followed a man, David Parker, broad-shouldered, commanding, his dark suit immaculate even in panic. His jaw was tight beneath a short beard, and his blue-gray eyes carried the sharpness of someone used to control but undone by loss. "Benji!" Sarah screamed, her voice breaking. "Mom!" the boy shouted, leaping from the truck and running into her arms. She fell to her knees, sobbing as she clutched him, her whole body shaking. David stood frozen, disbelief turning to something else. Suspicion. His gaze snapped toward Ethan. "Who are you?" he demanded, voice low but edged with fury. Ethan raised his hands slightly, palms open. "My name's Ethan Cole." I found your boy in the woods last winter. He was... David cut him off, stepping closer. You found him? And just decided to keep him for yourself? That's not how it was, Ethan said, his voice steady but heavy. The storm was bad. He would have died if I didn't take him in. I tried to. Sarah turned, tears still streaming down her face. You had him this whole time? Benji, frightened by their tone, clung to her sleeve. Mom, please, he saved me. He's my friend. David's expression hardened. Saved you? He stole you from us. He turned to the guard. Call the police. Ethan took a step back, realizing how it looked. An unshaven man from the woods, driving an old truck, bringing home a lost child after a year. He didn't resist as the officer who arrived minutes later approached cautiously, hand near his holster. Rex barked sharply, his hackles raised, sensing the tension. Easy, boy, Ethan murmured, placing a calming hand on his head. The officer, a middle-aged man with a gray mustache named Deputy Ross, spoke firmly. Sir, I'm going to need you to come with us. We'll get this sorted out at the station. It's fine, Ethan said quietly. I'll go. But before he could take another step, Benji ran forward, standing between Ethan and the police. No, he didn't do anything. He's my friend, he cried, tears streaming down his face. He saved me when I was cold. He taught me things. He took care of me and Rex. Sarah's sobs grew softer. She looked at Ethan again, at his rough hands, the scar on his cheek, the weariness in his eyes. There was no malice there, only sadness. She knelt beside Benji and looked at him gently. Is that true, sweetheart? Benji nodded fiercely. He's good, Mom. He's good. Deputy Ross hesitated. Mr. Parker, maybe we should... David's anger faltered as he looked at his son, the boy he'd prayed for every night. Slowly, reason began to return. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Let him talk, he said finally. Inside the house, Ethan explained everything. How he'd found Benji in the snow. How he'd tried to reach town, but the storm had cut him off. How the months had simply slipped away. Emily arrived later, vouching for him, confirming his story. When it was over, David looked at Ethan for a long moment. His shoulders sagged, the anger draining away, replaced by something closer to shame. You saved my son, he said quietly. And I accused you of the worst. Ethan shook his head. You were protecting your family. Any man would have done the same. Sarah wiped her eyes. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. Ethan nodded once, his voice low. He's a good kid. Take care of him. As he turned to leave, Benji broke free from his mother's arms and ran to him. Don't go, the boy cried, clutching Ethan's jacket. You promised we'd fish again. Ethan knelt, resting a rough hand on the boy's shoulder. You've got rivers where you're going, kid. Maybe one day. Rex barked softly beside him, tail low. The boy hugged the dog, pressing his face into the thick fur. Goodbye, Rex. Ethan straightened, gave Sarah and David one last nod, and walked out the door into the fading light. He didn't look back. As he and Rex disappeared down the long driveway, Sarah whispered through her tears, "Who was he?" Emily, standing by the porch, answered softly, "Someone who still believes in doing the right thing, even when it costs him everything." The years drifted by like leaves across the river, carrying with them the weight of time and memory. Miller's Creek had changed. New stores lined the main road. The gas station got repainted twice, and the hills beyond the town were dotted with cabins that hadn't been there before. But deep in the woods, past the last dirt trail and over the ridge where the air smelled of pine and rain, The old cabin still stood. The roof sagged a little now, the porch creaked, and smoke from the chimney curled thinly into the sky. It was still home for Ethan Cole. Ethan had grown older, though the forest had kept him strong. His once black hair was now mostly silver, his beard thicker, hiding the sharp lines of his jaw. The scar on his cheek had faded to a faint mark, like an old memory that refused to vanish. His hands were rough and scarred from work, the hands of a man who built his peace plank by plank. His eyes, though lined with age, still carried that same quiet steadiness, the kind that could look at a storm and not flinch. Rex was slower now, his muzzle graying, his steps measured but sure. He was 12 years old, a noble age for a German shepherd, but his eyes were still alert, warm, loyal as ever. He spent most of his days lying on the porch, watching birds and squirrels, tail thumping when Ethan came near. Sometimes, when the wind carried faint echoes from town, his ears would perk up, as if remembering something, or someone. That someone came one summer afternoon, when the air shimmered with heat and the cicadas sang endlessly in the trees. Ethan was mending the garden fence when he heard the sound of a truck engine climbing the dirt road, an unfamiliar sound in these parts. He straightened, wiping his brow, and shaded his eyes against the glare. The truck was new, glossy blue with city plates. When it stopped near the cabin, the driver stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, maybe 22 or 23, with dark hair and bright green eyes that Ethan would have recognized anywhere. Benji Parker had grown into a man. He was taller now, his frame athletic, sun-kissed from working outdoors. He wore a faded flannel shirt and jeans dusted with road dirt, and there was an openness in his smile that reminded Ethan of a boy who once chased fireflies around the cabin. "Hey, old man," Benji called with a grin, voice deeper but warm. Ethan laughed softly, shaking his head. "You found your way back." "Didn't think I'd forget," Benji said, walking closer. "Wasn't easy convincing Mom and Dad to let me drive up here alone, though." Ethan gave a mock frown. "You're what, 22 now? Don't tell me they still think you'll get lost." Benji chuckled, setting his bag down. "They worry, that's all. After, you know." Ethan nodded. He did know. The day he'd brought Benji home still sat somewhere in the back of his mind, sharp and bittersweet. But seeing him now, tall, alive, full of life, made it worth every ache. Rex, lying in the shade of the porch, lifted his head and gave a slow bark. Benji's face lit up. "Hey there, partner." He knelt beside the dog, scratching behind the ears. "You remember me, don't you?" Rex whined softly and pressed his muzzle against Benji's shoulder. The years between them vanished like mist. Inside the cabin, things were much the same. The same wooden table, the same stove, the same smell of pine and smoke. Ethan poured 2 cups of coffee, one stronger than the other. "You still take sugar?" he asked. 3 spoonfuls, Benji said, grinning. "Guess some things don't change." They sat together on the porch, watching the forest breathe in the afternoon light. For a while, neither spoke. Then Benji said quietly, "I enlisted, you know, the Marines." Ethan turned, surprise flickering across his face. "That so?" Benji nodded. "Figured if a man like you could live through it and still come out this decent, maybe there's something to learn from that." Ethan let out a slow breath, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "You sure about that life? It's not easy." Benji shrugged, his smile faint but certain. "I'm not looking for easy." For the next few days, Benji stayed in the cabin. He helped Ethan chop wood, fixed the roof with steady hands, and even rebuilt the small dock by the river that time had worn away. At night, they sat by the fire, telling stories. Ethan about the old days in Afghanistan, Benji about his parents, about college, about wanting to serve before coming back to help his family's foundation. The conversations were slow, meaningful, the kind that fill the spaces time had once taken. Rex followed them everywhere, sometimes limping, sometimes trotting along just like the old days. Benji made a small bed of blankets beside the fire for him and whispered, "You've still got it, old boy." Rex responded with a quiet grunt, curling up, his eyes glowing in the firelight. On the morning of Benji's last day, the air was cool again. They walked together to the ridge overlooking the valley. From there, the world stretched endlessly. Rivers like silver threads, hills soft with mist. Ethan leaned on his walking stick, the weight of years showing in his shoulders. "When I was your age," he said, "I thought peace was something you found by running away from people. Turns out, it's something you build, one act of kindness at a time." Benji listened, silent, the words sinking deep. As they headed back to the cabin, Benji stopped at the porch and turned. "You know," he said quietly, "I think I found a second father out here." Ethan smiled, lines creasing deeper around his eyes. "And I found a son I never knew I needed." They shook hands, though both knew the gesture was too formal for what they felt. When Benji climbed into his truck, Rex barked twice, his tail thumping weakly. The sound carried through the trees, low and full, like a memory come alive. Ethan stood at the end of the path, one hand raised. "Live well, son," he said. The truck rolled away slowly, dust rising behind it. Benji glanced in the mirror one last time. The cabin, the old man, and the faithful dog watching him fade into the distance. As the sound of the engine disappeared, Ethan turned back to the porch. Rex was lying there, head on his paws, eyes half closed. "We did good, didn't we, boy?" Ethan murmured. The dog's tail flicked once. In the quiet that followed, the forest seemed to breathe with them. One man, one dog, and the echo of love that had bridged years of silence. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or light from heaven. They come quietly, like a lost child in the snow, a wounded soldier searching for peace, or a loyal dog who never leaves your side. God doesn't always change our circumstances. Sometimes He changes our hearts through the people He sends into our lives. Ethan didn't know he was part of a divine plan when he lifted Benji out of the storm. He simply followed the whisper that told him, "Do the right thing." That's how miracles begin. One small act of kindness, one heart that chooses love over fear. In a world that often feels cold and distant, God still works through ordinary hands. Yours, mine, anyone willing to listen. Maybe you've met your own Benji or Ethan, someone who came into your life by chance but stayed by grace. Maybe your miracle hasn't come yet, but it's on its way, hidden in the most unexpected place. Just remember, when you love selflessly, when you forgive, when you protect, you become part of God's quiet miracles on earth. May God bless you and your family with peace, warmth, and faith, even through the storms. If this story touched your heart, don't let it stop here. Share this story to remind others that goodness still exists. Comment below what part moved you the most. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Subscribe to our channel to hear more stories of faith, compassion, and the small miracles God plants in everyday lives. And as always, may the Lord watch over you your loved ones, and every loyal soul that walks beside you.